The New York City Commission on Human Rights does not provide legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the views or position of the Commission. Enjoy the show.
Hello, New York. Welcome to another episode of Rights Here, Right Now from the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I'm your host, Jose Rios Lua, pronouns he, him. I'm the Chief of Staff at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Rights Here, Right Now airs the last Monday of every month on WHCR 90.3 FM. Each episode will give listeners the info they'll need to live, work, and thrive free from discrimination in our city. All episodes will also be posted on the Commission's website, YouTube channel, and Spotify. As always, before we dive into our topic, here's a little background information on our agency. The New York City Commission on Human Rights is the city's agency that protects New Yorkers from discrimination in employment, housing, and public spaces. The Commission is charged with enforcing the city's human rights law, one of the broadest civil rights laws in the nation. The law prohibits discrimination in over 25 protected categories, such as race, age, gender, gender identity, sexuality, nation of origin, and immigration status. New Yorkers can report discrimination to the Commission by calling 212-416-0197 or by visiting our website, nyc.gov/humanrights. The Commission also seeks to prevent discrimination by conducting outreach to educate New Yorkers on their rights and responsibilities under the law. The Commission provides trainings and workshops that detail the protections enshrined in the law. Our trainings are grounded in the idea that our rights are interconnected and that we all have a role to play in it to advance equity in New York City. You can request a training on our website. Again, that's nyc.gov/humanrights. And I am once again joined by the Commission's Deputy Commissioner of Policy and External Affairs, JoAnn Kamuf. JoAnn, welcome back.
Hi, Jose. How are you?
I'm doing well. It is February and it's starting to warm up a little bit, so I enjoy it.
Cold temperatures are appropriate in the winter.
We're also joined once again by the Commission's Urban Fellow, Leela Cullity Younger.
Hi there, everyone. Happy to be here.
It's been a month since we were on the radio show last. Anything fun anyone's been up to?
I went ice skating with some of the other urban fellows, which was really fun. Fell a few times, but it's what happens when you try something new.
Yesterday, I went to the Botanic Gardens in Brooklyn, which is something that seems like a summer activity, but it was actually really peaceful and beautiful. So if you haven't been there, hop on the 2 train and you can go to both the Brooklyn Museum and the Botanic Gardens.
And the Botanic Gardens has some really nice indoor exhibits too. And
yeah, there's tropical area if you're missing that. There's a bonsai exhibit and then soon to be cherry blossoms. What about you, Jose?
I know a few months ago we talked a little bit about exploring the city through food, and I've been exploring new restaurants in my area. So just been enjoying and waiting with bated breath for the warmer weather. Another fun thing that the Commission did was we hosted our Black History Month event with today's guest. Today's episode is a special one, and it comes at an important time, Black History Month. This is a moment to honor the resilience, contributions, and ongoing fight for justice within Black communities. It's also a time to reflect on the ways systemic discrimination continues to show up in everyday life, including in how Black hair is treated in the workplace, school, and in public spaces. We're diving into a conversation that goes beyond policy. It's about culture, identity, hair discrimination. And to help us explore this critical issue, we're honored to welcome a very special guest, Dr. Gillian Scott Ward, who is a filmmaker, clinical psychologist, and dedicated advocate for racial equity. As the director of Back to Natural, she explores the deep intersections of hair, politics, and identity in Black communities, shedding light on the global policing of natural Black hair. Dr. Scott Ward's work goes beyond storytelling. She has played a pivotal role in shaping policy, previously partnering with the New York City Commission on Human Rights to develop the city's first hair discrimination training programs when protections were introduced in 2019. Her commitment to equity and healing continues to drive critical conversations, making her a vital voice in the ongoing fight against racial discrimination. And before we bring in Dr. Scott Ward into the conversation, we have a clip from Back to Natural, her documentary.
The natural hair movement today is I'm peeling off this mask.
I felt empowered.
There is a freedom that's undescribable when you can just be authentic.
Clients come to us. Je voudrais un tapered cut. The reference now are through YouTube.
Seeing someone with naturally textured hair grow her hair into longer hair, it was exciting.
You would think that in South Africa, why does it take that much longer in our countries for this kind of information to be available? It's got a lot to do with economic freedom, access to internet.
I was made to sit on the floor.
That style is stuck in the 60s anti-establishment look, and it scares people who are awake to work every day because he was not allowed to wear dreadlocks.
That was audio from the trailer of Back to Natural, directed by Dr. Gillian Scott Ward. Dr. Scott Ward, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited that you made time to join us, and we have a question that we start every interview with, and I'm going to hand it over to JoAnn for that.
Okay, hello. Welcome to the show. So our first question is, what is your favorite thing to do in New York City?
My favorite thing to do in New York City is spend time both alone and my children in the North Woods of Central Park. During COVID, I had my first baby like 3 weeks before lockdown, and we didn't know what was safe, what we could do. And I took my baby to northern Central Park every day, and we would follow the tour groups of bird watchers, and we saw the snowy owl and got to learn about birding. So that is definitely my favorite thing to do in New York.
Yeah, there's a huge birding culture, which I just have recently learned about. Also, I live near Prospect Park, and I was talking to a friend who's an avid birder, and I said, where do you go? And she said, I go into Prospect Park, and there's hundreds of birds. It's the same in Central Park. It's amazing.
Yes, I learned that if you look at the tallest tree and look on the top of that, that's where the greatest birds can be.
So going into Back to Natural, your documentary, very, very powerful documentary. We saw the first 20 minutes in our event last week, and people walked away wanting more. For those who are listening who may not have seen the film or know of the film, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your journey into filmmaking and how that drove you to Back to Natural?
I'm a clinical psychologist, and I spent the first 10 years or so of my professional career working in university mental health, so psychologist at universities. And what was really wonderful there was, seeing people sort of like their early adulthood development and seeing how their identities kind of flourished. And, working in New York at these universities, I got to see a really broad range of people from a lot of different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, or countries of origin, language. And I think, I began to really see a unique pattern come up in the students I was working with in terms of Black students, as they were processing their identity development, like personal identity and also professional identities, the issue of hair and wondering how that would impact their ability to get jobs or internships or finding partners was really unique to that group. So being a psychologist, I really reflected on my own relationship with hair. And at that point, I had been relaxed from, I was probably, between 5 and 7 years old into my 30s. And I wasn't intentional. I was just doing it to do it. So when I just had this aha moment of I really have to be curious, I have to be intentional about what I'm doing with my hair, and maybe I could do a documentary. And when I was in graduate school, I was a fellow at the Colin Powell Center for Civic and Global Leadership. And at the Colin Powell Center, he takes people from a variety of backgrounds, getting master's degrees, getting doctorates, and says that whatever your specialty is, you can apply it to public policy. You can apply it to changing the worldview. And I think really that underlies why I felt like I could make an impact using film.
Could you go a little bit deeper into the policy side of things and why you really focused on raising awareness on natural hair discrimination and what that partnership with the commission kind of looked like back in 2019?
It's really interesting when we think about the movement to desegregate schools and the psychologists, the Clarks, who were really foundational with the black and white, the dog studies, right? And looking at how segregation helped to concretize and solidify this feeling of inferiority in Black children, right? And that was sort of really pivotal in saying, but this is not an equal education, right? You're telling them there's something wrong with them and they have to be in different kind of school systems. And so when you think about now schools are supposedly integrated, but Black children can't show up as themselves. They can't wear the braids, which is a style that is actually protective and helps to manage certain hair types. Or if they have an afro, it's seen as some sort of political statement. So in essence, telling Black children that who you are is inferior, right? That you have to shape yourself in a way that the majority culture says is acceptable. And I think that really does a detriment both to the children who are the target of these messages and in terms of identity development and self-esteem and self-concept and using energy that they could be using to explore their strengths and instead having to use that energy to sort of suppress themselves. But it also does a disservice to the other children who don't really get to know their classmates, who are basically coddled and told that we're going to make everyone as close to you as possible. I'm not really sure what the message is. Like, you know, you can't handle how other people show up, or you'll be distracted by difference, which I think is the message. It's like, should we be distracted by difference, or should we be curious and open and able to, like, sort of make space? And so in policy, I thought it was, you know, basic human rights. You know, after I did this international investigation, I just couldn't understand how this was still legal. Again, it was another moment where spirit made everything in alignment. Grace Sacro, who was the supervising attorney on cases related to natural hair discrimination, kind of reached out to me when the film was playing in a film festival in New York City and saw it and thought it was wonderful and brought us to the commission. And I had no idea sort of what would then happen.
One of the impacts of, I think, the collaboration that you have had with the commission is a recognition that the law, which addresses race discrimination and religious discrimination, addresses differential treatment based on the identity characteristics and, you know, cultural significance and meaning of hairstyles. So just, again, taking a lens of personal experience, but also looking at structural policies and thinking about what can the law do as a lawyer, right? What are the tools we have, and how does the law address that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really important because it sort of forces people to be expansive in their understanding of equality and equity. And I think that's really important.
Dr. Scott Ward, you have a unique perspective because of all of the different intersections in your life and lived experience that, like, gives you a unique window into this topic. So not only are you a Black woman with lived experience, not only are you an advocate, but you're a clinical psychologist. And so, like, that adds a different layer into understanding of what this type of thing does to a person. And so you talked a little bit about how when the messaging, like, gets reinforced in systemic racism, like in schools and in work, what that does to a person's self of work. But one of the things I think was really reflective that's in your movie and that I thought was interesting for people to just have, like, that light bulb moment in the room when we were watching is some folks talk about how their first experience with discrimination when it comes to hair isn't actually in the workplace or at school. It's, you know, at home in the kitchen. The first experiences of learning that your hair may not be acceptable to somebody else. What does that do also to a person's value of self-worth to have those experiences in your formative years, right? Because this is happening to children as early as 3, 4, 5 years old, right?
When the people who love you the most, right? These are mom, dad, grandparents, aunts, uncles, sort of imply that your hair has something to do with your worthiness and that it's not good enough or that's not beautiful enough. It needs to be drastically shifted in order to make you acceptable. It sort of does something to your relationship to yourself and to your own body, right? And what kind of energy is that you're rejecting something core and central to yourself? And we can't turn off and on the energy that we direct towards ourselves. So we can't say, well, I wholly reject my physical appearance, but, you know, then I can feel good about this other aspect of myself, right? It kind of bleeds over. Yeah. So I think it is potentially damaging. But, you know, on the other hand, I think we have to be really compassionate that people transmute this message, not because they're bad people or they're trying to be harmful, but because there has been in the history globally, not just this country, but globally, a currency. And that currency is sort of proximity or closeness to a particular ideal or standard. And so there was currency in straight hair. There's currency are real. But there's also currency in self-worth and value.
So New York City is not the only place where hair discrimination is recognized as a violation of the law. Can you talk about the landscape nationally and some efforts to have these protections codified through laws such as the Crown Act?
Yeah, so nationally, 27 states have adopted the Crown Act. So there's 23 states to go, and there's sort of other jurisdictions that have passed the Crown Act. So the Crown Act right now has passed the Senate and it's stalled in the House. And so I don't know where it's going to be sort of on the federal level anytime soon. But I think 27 states is remarkable, and I hope that we can continue to expand that.
For anyone listening who might not be familiar with the Crown Act, can you just tell us a little bit about what it is and what protections it would include?
So the Crown Act prohibits discrimination based on natural hair texture or curly hair. So it says that, your grooming standards in school or in a workplace can't specifically prohibit things like braids, locks, twists, cornrows, afros, bantu knots, that these things are protected because they're inextricably tied to race, right? These hairstyles are basically used to protect certain types of hair textures. And so hairstyle and race are tied.
Internationally, have you seen similar uptick and uptake of these protections? Is there resistance? I'm just curious what that has looked like in the conversations you've had and seen.
I mean, look, I think there's absolutely resistance. There's a lot of movement. In Brazil, there's a thriving natural hair movement connected to a thriving natural hair movement in France. In South Africa, there are historic protests. I'm not 100% sure legally what's happening in those places.
Your film does a really good job at sort of painting a historical picture of how media representation has shaped perceptions of Black hair and has shifted throughout the years. So I'm curious, what shifts are you seeing in media portrayals of natural hair today through all the forms of social media and expansion that we have?
I think what's really wonderful and really beautiful is that we now see natural hair more in the media. Like, certainly when you're turning on the TV and you're seeing Black women, you're so much more likely in advertisements particularly to see natural hair. And I think that is really important. Natural hair care is very expensive. So I think that in terms of advertising, people have realized that there's a lot of money to be made. With marketing to naturalistas, right? People who are natural. So, not to make it about capital, I think that's part of the reason why we're actually seeing so much of it. It's very, very expensive to maintain, and so I don't want to leave that out of the conversation. And it takes a lot of time, and that is also a privilege. And so there's a lot of intersections on time and money that I think is important to just be clear about.
Your documentary highlights personal stories about hair discrimination, which plays a key role in recognizing the importance of changes in law and in culture. What is one actionable step that people can take to foster workplace environments or communities that support natural hair expression?
I can give you two, if that's okay. The first one is examine the grooming standards. Right? So if you work at a school, if you're employed in a company, look at your grooming standards and do they adhere to the natural hair protections, right? Do they explicitly call out things like cornrows or braids or locks or afros? If they do, that's not in compliance. So that's one thing that you can do to make sure that your organization is compliant. In addition, what I would do is I would encourage people to have people who are involved in hiring watch Back to Natural so that they can begin to be curious about the conscious and unconscious beliefs they have about natural hair. Because what we want to do is we want to invite people to be curious about what comes up for them when they see natural hair. Do they see it and do they question someone's professionalism, right? And if they do, they can slow themselves down and say, hold on, that's an unconscious bias.
These kind of what I will say, unrealistic beauty standards that exist are used as like a tool of oppression, right? For a very specific group of people. And so whenever someone is in the process of recognizing that this is a tool for oppression, there's a point of like kind of like decolonizing or deconstructing the thought that enforces the tool of oppression, right? And so there's a deconstruction phase, right? And then that leads into a healing phase. But in the healing phase of this, some people have the misconception or the unfounded thought that healing is going to feel good. And so can you talk a little bit about like what that process is like for something? I think people underestimate how intrinsically tied into your identity hair can be, right? And so there is a big step into someone who may have their entire life been subject to relaxers or to try to conform their natural body to a certain standard. And part of taking your power back in your identity includes healing from the trauma that's been caused already, right?
All healing benefits from us to sit in an energy of compassion. We did not choose to develop in cultures that may diminish aspects of ourselves. That's just a situation we find ourselves in. And everyone is doing the best they can to survive within this system. And once we've done that, then we can ask ourselves, okay, so I've now survived, and what's going to help me go beyond survival? What's going to help me feel like I'm living in alignment with my values? For me, on one hand, I was like, my values are like my health. Meanwhile, exposing myself to the toxic chemicals involved in relaxers were not healthy, right? They're connected to, it's a carcinogen. They're connected, to a wide variety of health problems, right? I wouldn't kind of like slap on this level of chemicals anywhere else on my body but my scalp. So for me, it was like compassionately understanding I did what I did because that's what I knew. And now I'm allowing myself to sort of like awaken and make different choices and sort of live more intentionally and be compassionate with myself as I make that shift.
You said something during the screening, and I probably will not say it correctly, so please feel free to correct me, but allowing people to sit in their own identities benefit us all. Yeah. And I just thought that was such a beautiful sentiment into saying like letting people show up how they are, who they are, is a benefit to everyone. It's not threatening anybody. It doesn't benefit anyone to see a censored version of someone. It's really demoralizing to a person to know that like in order for me to be considered serious and engaging in this process, whether that's work, whether that's school, whether that's just going to the grocery store, I have to conform to the standard so that I don't get too looked at or I don't get dismissed. It is not great for the person experiencing, but then the piece that like really was resonating with me is that like it's not great for people outside of the experience as well, because you're closing yourself off to an entire experience that's someone's truth. Just inclusion benefits everybody. We just have to continue ringing that bell over and over again until it sits with every person.
And I'm just sitting with, something else we talked about is sort of what it feels like in a person's body who's threatened by another person's authentic presence. Oftentimes it's like fear of the unknown. It's fear of someone else's truth and how important it is for people to be able to attune to what's happening in their bodies, be really curious about their response, and learn to like soothe themselves.
At this moment, I wanted to remind our New York listeners what their protections are under the human rights law in this space. You as a New Yorker have the right to express your racial, religious, and cultural identity through your hair. And, hair discrimination is a pretty simple concept. It's when people are treated less well because of the way that they're wearing their hair. The New York City Commission on Human Rights recognizes hair discrimination as illegal. Now, some people might say, does that mean we cannot have grooming policies? No, that is not what that means. Requirements around maintaining a work-appropriate appearance can be permissible as long as these policies are enforced in a way that is equitable for all employees. And I think you already talked a little bit about what the Crown Act says, but you cannot just ban outright particular hairstyles that relate to a cultural, racial, or religious identity. I think there are some situations in settings like you work in a cafeteria. There are restrictions like having all people wear a hairnet. That can be fine, but you're getting into closer to a violation of the law if you're calling out particular hairstyles. In particular, when hairstyle or a head covering is a manifestation of a religious belief, employers have to recognize the possibility of a reasonable accommodation so that someone can respect their own religious beliefs in the workplace and think about alternatives to a policy that might hinder religious expression.
Can you talk a little bit about the real ways that people engage with this type of discrimination, and they might not even be noticing this because it's coded in language?
For a very long time, very strict standards and guidelines around for women, right? Straight hair is seen as professional. For men, black men, short cuts, certainly not locks, have been connected to the idea of professionalism. But inherent is the idea that you cannot be professional and also black.
Yeah, it sends a message of like who can and can't be inherently professional, and who has to work, twice as hard to be seen as professional.
Right. Who has to spend, 8 times the amount of money on beauty products to reach the ideal? Well, women of color. That's what it's shown. Who has to expose themselves to an exponential amount of toxic chemicals in these products to either lighten your skin or straighten your hair? Women of color.
And I can't help but to feel that the message, when these types of policies are in the workplace or in schools, that the message that we're sending to women of color is, how much are you willing to sacrifice to be allowed to sit at the table? And so that should be the point where everyone should walk away when they're seeing these types of policies in their workplace or at schools or what have you. That is the actual question that we're asking women of color. How much are you willing to financially, medically, emotionally, to be a part of a table where we walk up with no cost?
Right. And then make a fraction of the money to do so.
Really appreciate the time you made for us. And we have another clip. If for anyone who's listening, if they're interested in viewing the documentary, is there a way for folks to be able to access it?
It is available widely online. I know we were on Tubi for a while. We're still probably on Tubi. We were on Amazon for those who are still using Amazon. But if we just Google Back to Natural documentary, you'll be able to find it on multiple streaming platforms. And if not, anyone's free to reach out to me through my website, and I can send you a private link.
Dr. Gillian Scott Ward, thank you again for joining us. We appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Having relaxed here was easier in some ways. I think the question that has to be asked is why we might choose the easier route with regard to natural hair, as opposed to saying, well, it's just easier to have my kid go to the school down the street as opposed to, the school that's further away but might offer a better quality of education. The choices we make around our hair require the same level of thought and commitment to whatever it is you want to achieve.
At a very young age, I remember being clear that the straighter your hair was, the more manageable it was, the better that it was. I understood that the more it curled up, the more nappy, so to speak, it was, the more of a problem it was, to the extent that I remember my grandmother on bad hair days not even wanting to go to church. And I also even remember the way that my brothers were kind of divided by hair, because I have a brother who's darker and a brother who's lighter. And I remember them always commenting on how pretty my lighter brother's hair was because he had waves.
Where I grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, we're very Southern, like ultimate Southern belle. And a lot of the African-American women didn't walk out of the house without a relaxer. If they didn't have that relaxer, it was viewed as nappy, or there was a ball cap thrown on, or something would be on their head to cover it because it was almost shameful to walk out with their natural hair,
When you can't imagine your world and your life
with natural hair, then something's been done to you. And a lot of the stories that you hear about young people, college students, when they first start to think about these issues, a lot of their first trauma comes from in the home. It's not the people kicking them out of school. It's not when they go to get their first job. It's their aunts and their mothers and their father who police their bodies, and how difficult it is for Black children to feel beloved.
So if I'm doing my child's hair, my daughter's hair, and her memories of our hair times are tense and they are full of me pulling her head to one side and her jerking it back to the other, or her wincing from the pain of the hot comb because the smoke and the heat got too close, and me telling her to grit her teeth and to calm down and to be quiet, and ain't nobody got time for that, and you can't be tender-headed. And those types of aggressive maneuvers around hair into feelings and emotions of shame really crystallize an idea that there is something substandard about our hair.
It's such a great interview with Dr. Gillian Scott Ward. We do see these types of cases at the commission, and folks can report it to us, but hair itself is not its own protected category. Is that correct?
Yes. What I want to clarify is not that there was a protection that needed to be added to the city human rights law, but that protections against discrimination and differential treatment based on race, or as I mentioned, religion, those protections include your ability to manifest your beliefs through hair as one example.
Well, there's resources available on our website. There's a campaign available. Have you seen in through your work any ways and cases, or have you in any of materials that we put out, ways that this might play out in the workplace or in schools?
I think this comes up a lot in sports in particular, because there are some rules around what is quote unquote safe. There are and can be legitimate safety concerns around wearing jewelry or having long hair that could get tangled in another person, for example, during some sports. But there's also examples of allowing someone with fine or thin hair to have long hair, but saying you can't have dreadlocks. That's the kind of example that we're talking about that would violate the city human rights law. So if there's a length requirement and that is tied to a safety concern, that is likely to be found legitimate. When you start differentiating amongst hairstyles and those are connected to a protected category like race or religion, then that's going to be considered problematic. For folks who are creating policies and practices, think about what is the justification if we are putting limitations on what someone can wear or dress like or how they express themselves, and really is this the narrowest way to get there, and one that allows people to still show up to work expressing themselves consistent with their identity.
If someone would have not understand whether or not a policy for grooming or whatever would be acceptable under the human rights law, is there a process to find out whether your policy is in violation or not in violation with the commission, or is that simply ask us if you have a question?
So we don't typically review specific individual policies, but we can identify if you have questions about something and you're asking, might this comply with the human rights law? You can reach out to our policy team and we can opine on that. But I think the general guidelines is think, what is the legitimate non-discriminatory interest that a policy is serving, right? And I mentioned already, example, we've seen and we see in hospitals and in food service situations, people wear gloves, people put their hair up for health and hygiene reasons. But I think every time you have a limitation like that, just evaluating what is the rationale behind this. I mean, we've already talked about in this conversation, there's explicit bias, and then there's just things that people have written down because that's how it's been. And sometimes those policies too can have a discriminatory impact on some of the workforce or some of your students. So I think being really intentional about talking about policies with your employees and your managers and teachers if you're a school, and then evaluating periodically, does this policy still make sense? Is it meeting a specific need, and what is that need?
I know there are certain provisions of our law where there's a waiver process. Is this not one of those protections for applying for a waiver for the commission.
Correct. There are no times when race or religious discrimination is an area where you would get a blanket exemption from the commission for public policy reasons. What I referenced before and what exists in our law for religious practices and beliefs, disability, pregnancy, and survivors of domestic violence is that there's reasonable accommodation processes. So in the example of hair, if you are wearing your hair in a particular way or wearing a head covering for a particular reason, an employer says that violates our policy, there should be the opportunity to ask for reasonable accommodation for your religious practice. That doesn't exist for all of the protected categories in our law, but it does for this one.
JoAnn, as always, thank you for being the voice of the New York City human rights law on the show. I truly appreciate it. Leela, thanks for joining us again and for helping set up the interview with Dr. Gillian Scott Ward today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, New Yorkers, that is all we have for you today. If you have experienced or witnessed discrimination, contact the Commission to report it. You can report discrimination online at nyc.gov/humanrights or by calling us at 212-416-0197. Thank you for tuning in to Rights Here, Right Now. Remember that we all must work together to create a city where New Yorkers can live, work, and thrive free from discrimination.